good evening, and it's a great pleasure to welcome my colleague from Geneva, Tom Biersteker here. Tom and I have been colleagues since 5 years in Geneva. It's the first time that we've managed to finally entice him to
Sorry about this.
come to the IWM. And it's a great pleasure to have you on a topic of really timely relevance, and that is the nature of UN sanctions and their effects. Thomas Biersteker is the Gasteiger Professor of International Security. He is currently also Director of Policy Research at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And he was directing, or he still is directing, the Graduate Institute's program for the study of international governance until very recently. I think he's handed it over to colleagues. He came to the Graduate Institute from the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown, and prior to that, he has taught at Yale and at the University of Southern California. He has too many books, which, if I were to describe all of them, it's going to take up all his speaking time. So I'm going to just concentrate on two current projects which link to the talk tonight, and also say something about the broader context of this work on targeted sanctions. So, the two books which I would like to mention are State Sovereignty as a Social Construct, written in 96, The Emergence of Private Authority in Global Governance, 2002, and then the book which came out last year, which will form part of the subject of tonight's talk, Targeted Sanctions, the Impacts and Effectiveness of United Nations Action. He's been also looking at transnational policy networks, not only around the issue of sanctions, but also around global security architecture and global security governance more broadly. And he has developed an app, a sanctions app. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure we're going to hear something about it. It's a tool he created for mobile devices in 2013 to increase access to information about targeted sanctions at the UN. More broadly, he's also been involved in research on United Nations reform and its effectiveness. This is a research project it is carrying on to understand the UN's own ability to reform itself in order to enhance its effectiveness. I think a topic which has exercised many people in the last years on the question of on an issue of global governance. And what it does what he's trying to do in the project is to map, if I understand rightly, reform across 5 or 6 different UN agencies, across different dimensions of institutional design. And it's a project which looks at the effectiveness of these organizations over time, and to see if there is a relationship and what relationship there is between the effectiveness of the organization and different kinds of reforms which it has undertaken. So the talk that we're going to hear today is part of a project where he has co-directed the project on the targeted sanction with the Targeted Sanctions Consortium, 2009 until last year, and it's a group of some 50 scholars and policy practitioners worldwide who have worked with him on the subject. They've produced two databases, one qualitative and quantitative, and all the 22 UN targeted sanctions regimes, including a couple of policy manuals describing the findings of this research. So I'm looking forward to hearing something which has been the subject of a lot of policy debate and also academic research, and also, I think, of public interest in the last few years. Welcome to the IWM, and you have the word.
All right. Thank you very much, Shalini, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. She's right. She's been trying. It's just been a scheduling issue, mostly, I'm afraid, over the last several months or maybe a year and a half or so. It would have been better to have presented this closer to the publication date, but what I will do is I'll talk not only about the findings of the book, but then subsequent research we've done since the book came out just last year, in April of last year. And as you mentioned, by way of introduction, it is very much the product of a large group effort, multinational, multi-year effort to look at the history and the consequences of United Nations targeted sanctions. So I have a PowerPoint slide demonstration. What I will do is some of the slides have already been given by Shalini, but I'll start with the cover of the book. You can see the book here. I'm giving it to the library this evening, so I'm pleased to add this to your collection for future scholars interested in this. The one thing that's missing from this is on the back cover, which is an endorsement by former Secretary General Kofi Annan. And those of you who may know the UN and the UN under his leadership, he's a sanctions skeptic. So getting Kofi Annan to say, basically, I don't like sanctions, but if you're going to use them, read this book. It's basically, he doesn't quite say it that way or that informally, but that is what he says on the back of the cover of the book. But Shalini mentioned the Targeted Sanctions Consortium. This was basically the product of reflection on now the UN has more than 25, 26 years of experience with the application of targeted sanctions measures. And despite that, there hadn't been any comprehensive systematic analysis of the effectiveness of these measures. I'll say more about what are targeted sanctions in a few moments, but largely they're simply in contrast to the application of comprehensive sanctions that are applied, comprehensive trade and financial sanctions applied to an entire country during a particular period of time. And there really hadn't been, I mean, the obvious question is, well, if they're targeted, are they less effective or are they as effective because they're not likely to have as large an impact on an entire population? And so we formed the Targeted Sanctions Consortium in 2009, 2000, and concluded it with the publication of our book last year. And basically the consortium included, as Shalini mentioned, more than 50 scholars, and I want to emphasize policy practitioners as well, and from around the world. In fact, the practitioners, this is an important point for my portfolio at the Graduate Institute as Director for Policy Research, because I think it's very important if you're going to do policy-related research to engage the policy practitioners at the beginning of the project. More often than not, scholars will do their research, they'll come up with policy conclusions or recommendations at the end, and basically tell practitioners what they got wrong. And in this particular case, as we designed the research project, we invited practitioners, people from the UN Security Council, from the Sanctions Unit, member states of the Security Council, both permanent and non-permanent members, to come to Geneva to help us plan and design the research. And we did so not because we wanted them to tell us what to do, since we're independent scholars, we're not going to pay any attention even if they did, but we wanted to find out what would be most useful or relevant from their standpoint. And we said, we're going to be doing this research on all these UN targeted sanctions cases anyway. Are there particular questions that you would like us to answer? And so the project actually produced, as Shalini mentioned, several databases as a result. And the researchers that worked on the project include researchers from South America, Africa, Asia, North and South America. I mean, what am I missing? I mean, it was global in scope. Now, obviously, predominantly North American and European, but nonetheless, it was an attempt to try to have perspectives from multiple continents as well as multiple policy and scholarly perspectives. Now, the outputs, we have a practitioner's guide. There are two versions. Please disregard the 2012 version. There's another story with that, but that's the danger when scholars put something out too quickly and then subsequently reanalyze the data and find, it's not quite as effective as we thought. So the 2013 was a preliminary, before the book came out, sort of assessment of our initial findings. We've produced two databases, a qualitative structured narratives of UN cases of targeted sanctions, as well as a quantitative database. We've conducted policy briefings in major capitals around the world, but also capitals in the developing world and in former Soviet republics. We've tried to disseminate the results as much as possible to different constituencies. The most, for me personally, gratifying opportunity was this summer I was asked to address the UN Security Council. in an ARIA formula meeting, which is a rare experience. Individuals normally do not get access to the council, only states talk to them. But they invited me, the Egyptians organized a meeting, and I was the professor at a Security Council session in July of this year. The book, of course, we've already mentioned, and Sanctions App. In fact, the date, I got the date wrong. You were right, 2013. I put this slide together today. It's available. It's not something I'm selling. So if you're really interested in following sanctions, there's no cost involved. It's a free public good funded by the Swiss government. It's available from the Apple Play Store, the App Store, and the Android Play Store. It's not a game, however. And it's also available online. And this is largely because we designed it for elected or non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, basically to give them access to information about sanctions, to level the playing field when they're in fact involved in the design or either the design of new sanctions regimes or the administration of existing ones, since the non-permanent members tend to chair sanctions committees. So there's a sanctionsapp.com for desktop work, and that was actually prepared after we prepared the app because there was demand from non-permanent members. Also the permanent members use it, at least two. The databases, it depends on how many of you are interested in the scholarly side and the use of the databases. They're now both publicly available. The qualitative is available on Sanctions App. The quantitative contains 63 what we call case episodes. And I should maybe say a bit about that. Our unit of analysis is not country cases. Most studies and comparative work on sanctions look at, and you'll hear me talk about the Iran sanctions, the DPRK, North Korea sanctions, or the Central African Republic sanctions. But we find that in many cases, the longer the sanctions are in place, for example, Somalia has had sanctions regime in place for over 25 years. But the purpose of the sanctions regime, the targets of the sanctions regime, and the types of sanctions have all changed over that 25-year period. So our unit of analysis, I think in Somalia, we now have 5 distinct episodes where we look at the impacts and the effectiveness within those episodes. And so that becomes our unit of analysis. That's why we go from 23 in the database. Now on the app, we have 25. We'll add the 26th next January. But 63 cases with 296 variables for each. That's a very large matrix. And it's accessible at the Graduate Institute's website at this address, or soon it will be available at the Journal of Peace Research because they're publishing a data feature on the databases sometime in the next year. And the databases are updated annually when the app is. So that's the next test. In fact, our internal working version right now has 70 episodes. Now, this is the scope of the project, and this is the most colorful slide I have to offer. Well, no, I have another one, equally colored. What this shows you, I don't know if is there a little dot on this? Oh, yes, good, okay. From the top to the bottom, this is just chronological order of targeted sanctions measures. So the first case that we have is against the former Yugoslavia, particularly, well, it's actually, we have Serbia in parens, that's to differentiate it from the second FRI case, which is over Kosovo. But this was basically an arms embargo that was imposed initially in 1991. And then, notice it switches from yellow, conflict, cease hostilities, peace enforcement, to white. White means comprehensive sanctions. This is a case where there were targeted measures in place, followed by comprehensive. Hence a second episode. So each one of these line segments constitutes an episode. Somalia, I mentioned, 5 episodes over a very long period of time. Initially, the initial sanctions in Somalia were against basically clan infighting, involved only an arms embargo, and was designed to protect humanitarian actors providing relief within the Somali conflict. That's the inter-clan conflict. Today, of course, Somalia involves Al-Shabaab. For a period, it involved concerns about piracy off the coast of East Africa. So the whole purposes, targets have changed dramatically over time. The colors signify, the most dominant color, of course, is gold or yellow on this particular slide. And that's not too surprising because we're looking only at United Nations targeted sanctions in this research, where we've done work, and many of us have also worked on European Union and other sanctions regimes. But it's not surprising the UN Charter is focused particularly on armed conflict, the application of sanctions, and other measures with regard to armed conflict. So it's not terribly surprising that that is the dominant color. But notice the red, counterterrorism. It's not just a post-September 11 phenomenon. The UN was involved in counterterrorism sanctions back in the 1990s, directed against the government of Libya because of its support or the charge that there were Libyan government agents responsible for the downing of the Pan Am flight and the UTA flights in the late 1980s. So counterterrorism has been around, the red bars, which reflect that for a long period of time. The second one on Sudan over the attempted assassination of Hosni Mubarak. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda starting in 1998, although initially it was directed against the Taliban. I can go into the cases in more detail later if you wish. Among the others, the purple color. Now, we had some difficulties deciding how to classify this color because we called it initially democracy promotion because it appeared to be the purpose in the sanctions applied against the Cedras regime that overthrew Aristide in the early 1990s. But subsequently, we see that the UN usually doesn't intervene in the name of democracy. It more likely will intervene in the name of reestablishing a constitutionally elected government or in the name of supporting a transitional government arrangement. So all of those are lumped into one category. We now call it political transition support or democracy support, depending on the time. One of the other major innovations was 2006, when the UN for the first time applied sanctions on proliferation-related issues, and sanctions against both Iran and the DPRK were initiated in 2006. And then, I'm afraid it's an N of one, but sanctions applied to reinforce a relatively new norm, or at least newly agreed upon norm, of responsibility to protect, which was invoked against the Libyan regime in the spring of 2011, during the Arab Spring. So this is basically, it gives you, basically each segment is one of our cases. We've added the more recent ones that are not in the quantitative database, Yemen and South Sudan. Now we'll have to add Mali because Mali was just added to the sanctions list in August of this year. And it also shows you the density of activity over time. If you just did a vertical line through here, you can see that in the beginning, there were as many as 4 or 5, during the so-called sanctions decade of the 1990s, there were as many as 7 or 8. Well, today there are 15 different sanctions regimes in place in varying degrees. So just the sheer scope of application, the amount of work, the amount of institutional activity, if you look at the list today, and we have one more to add to this chart when we update it in January. So that's the scope of the project. That's basically the base of information upon which I'm talking. This is just basically the point I made a moment ago, that most of the sanctions are applied in conflict situations. Counterterrorism is second, followed by democracy support, and proliferation basically roughly tied, and then other being R2P and other categories. Now, I mentioned at the outset, there are different types of sanctions. And the main point, of course, that we're interested in, we're looking at this relatively new, but actually it wasn't. In fact, no, let me give a sort of historical. I would say already in retrospect, we're looking back in time at the two sanctions regimes that existed before the end of the Cold War, both of which were based on white minority rule governments in Africa, southern Africa. First against Rhodesia in the 1960s, and then against South Africa in the late 70s. It turns out those were not comprehensive measures. Those were also targeted measures. The interesting thing about our own project and our own thinking about it was we thought, well, we're seeing the move away from comprehensive toward targeted, but it turns out there were targeted measures. There was a period of comprehensivization of sanctions, Iraq, Haiti, former Yugoslavia, and every sanctions regime since has been targeted. So we have not had a new UN comprehensive sanctions regime since 1994. Now, that doesn't mean the Iraq regime didn't stay in place. It stayed in place as a comprehensive until 2003, but nonetheless, we haven't had any new. So all UN sanctions today are targeted. By the way, all EU sanctions are targeted. And after 2000, all US sanctions are targeted in some way. But what does that mean? Let's unpack the category. There are different types of targeting. One type is individual targeting. Any one of us in this room could be targeted by the UN Security Council, added to a list, have our assets frozen, have financial transfers blocked, have our right to travel impeded because there's a travel ban on our movement. If you're on the list, let me know. We know some, there are ways of getting off, but it's not very easy because individuals do not have standing before the UN Security Council. That's another set of issues I'll come to toward the end. Corporate entities are also targeted. That means companies that are involved in the evasion of sanctions. But corporate entities can also refer to political parties. So the Taliban were sanctioned. UNITA in Angola was sanctioned. These are all examples of different types of corporate entities being targeted by the UN Security Council. That's a fairly focused type of targeting. The UN also has sectoral targeting, where it targets one area of activity and applies restrictions to it. So an arms embargo would be a classic example of a sectoral, where one sector of military activity, or applying diplomatic restrictions on the movement of diplomatic personnel or the size of diplomatic missions. But most of this involves, of course, sectoral measures where there are commodity sanctions in place, where you have a particular kind of you find probably the classic example of this would be the embargo on the export of rough-cut diamonds that are not certified by the Cambrigde process. So this would be an example of a type of commodity base. And basically, the UN applied these sectoral measures to actors who were using the revenue from the sale of these commodities to support the conflict. And so they were initially introduced in Angola, then applied in Sierra Leone, Liberia. Timber sanctions were introduced in Liberia. Charcoal sanctions were introduced in Somalia. And of course, the proliferation-related goods were introduced in both Iran and North Korea. But then sometimes the UN applies sanctions not to an entire country, but to an area of the country. So some of the eastern provinces of the DRC, or the UN sanctions on Sudan are only on Darfur, not on the entire country. And sometimes the UN even, these are rather difficult, but the UN sanctions, there are no UN sanctions in Syria today. I'll talk about this toward the end. But there are, of course, sanctions on ISIL and Al-Qaeda operating in Syria. So those are sanctions that are basically on the areas under the control of ISIL or areas under the control of Al-Qaeda. So these are territorial. These are all different types of targeting, and that means the UN puts them together in all sorts of different combinations. We've produced a menu of different types of targeting that the UN has introduced over the last 25 years, and at last count, in the end of 2016, we had 76 different variations, different types of restrictive measures. So that's just the whole list. And then typically what the UN does is it combines several types of them to tailor the sanctions to the particular conflict or to the particular issue involved. It gets very complex. In some work we've been doing since we finished the book, and particularly work I've been doing with one of my PhD students, Marco Stadino, who's the third editor in the Cambridge Press book, we've been looking at variation in how many people are affected by the targeted measures, because we have quite a variation. Individual measures are really can be quite focused. When the UN sanctions in Sudan are on 4 individuals, well, that's very focused. That's as targeted. You can't really talk about humanitarian impacts of targeted measures when there are only 4 people on the list. Although the counterterrorism list at one point exceeded 500 individuals, so there are variations but nonetheless, these are relatively targeted measures. Category 2 refer to sectoral measures that affect diplomats, affect militaries, may affect rebel factions, non-state armed groups. These are what we call category 2, so they're having greater impact on more people, but still relatively modest. When you apply a sectoral commodity sanction, timber exports out of Liberia, well, then you're affecting the timber producing parts of the country. So you're now having broader regional impacts with the measures. And some sectoral measures go even further. They're relatively non-discriminating. If you impose a sectoral limitation on the financial sector, Well, as the EU did against Iran with the banning of with all SWIFT transactions back in 2012. These are non-discriminating. The entire population is affected because everyone's affected by finance. And you can make a similar argument about oil or shipping. These are relatively non-discriminating measures. And then category 5 for us is, well, the next step is comprehensive trade embargo. No trade, no finance, no economic communication. So we've taken this and we put it onto this scale. And this is just the definition. But the more interesting point is we've taken these categorizations, color-coded them, and then superimposed them on that chart I showed you a few moments ago. Different colors now. And this is, it's a terrible word, the targetedness of UN sanctions over time. The least discriminating measures are red and yellow, so that's the hot end of the continuum. Those are comprehensive and relatively non-discriminating measures. Cooling down, the most targeted measures are the light blue, the purple, and the green. And so what this shows us is over time, we could almost call it institutional learning. The UN is actually becoming more targeted in its application of these measures over time. And there are lots of reasons for this. We can talk about how much there's learning, how much it's lack of political will. But on the other hand, I'll say more about whether wider, broader sanctions are more effective in a moment. But this is an interesting insight for us into change over time against again the idea of reform within the UN system and documenting its effects and changes over time. I think, however, we're about to change. I know when we do the next update on North Korea, we'll switch it to category 4 because that's where the sanctions are going at the moment. But here's a correlation only between how targeted the measures are and how effective we think they are. So if you only apply individual measures, and that's all you have, and 6% of the cases are of that sort, they're never effective. So if you're super targeted, you're not going to have any effects. The relatively discriminating measures increase in frequency and have somewhat greater degree of success. But interestingly, it's the moderately discriminating measures, sectoral measures, that appear to have the greatest impact or the greatest effectiveness. Most interesting, however, is the bottom line. If you go from category 3 to category 4, affecting an entire population, the effectiveness drops. And there's basically, it's graphically displayed here. What this tells us or suggests, it doesn't really tell us because we don't have a large enough sample to make very many robust statistical generalizations out of this, but it's very suggestive because it suggests that more is not necessarily better. That is, if you continue to widen and broaden the scope of the sanctions, you don't necessarily get more effective outcomes. So there's a real trade-off here at some level. There's a so-called in tennis, I guess, a sweet spot that you're aiming for. It may be closer to category 3 than to category 4, the relatively non-discriminating measures. Now, another correlation we did, well, I'll come to that in a minute. I'll come back. Let me make one other very important point from our standpoint, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of water, if I may. The very important point from our research is that much of the public discourse, much of the policy discourse, much of the scholarly research, excuse me, would actually suggest that the main purpose of sanctions is to coerce a change in behavior. And of course, I mean, that is one of the main reasons you're trying to compel, you're trying to change the behavior of an actor. You want North Korea to give up its missile and nuclear program. You wanted Iran to do the same. You want certain parties to the conflicts in the Sahel and in Central Africa to desist from engaging in these activities. You want to see constitutional governments restored in Guinea-Bissau. These are goals of sanctions, yes. But interestingly, not all sanctions are intended to change behavior. And they're oftentimes intended to do multiple things. So it's not just, yes, it would be nice if they change their behavior, but if you don't think that's very likely, because the change of behavior is core to the identity of the actor, then sanctions are applied to constrain the actor. You basically try to degrade the capacity of an actor to continue to engage in proscribed activities. It may be continuing to selectively assassinate members of the opposition or could be, would you make it, or the financing of terrorism, the counterterrorism sanctions are typically designed to constrain groups engaged in the commitment of acts of terrorism from being able to continue to engage in those activities. It doesn't mean that they stop. It simply means that you block people who may be financing them or make it more difficult for them to move money across borders to commit larger, more significant acts of terrorism. So you either raise their costs or force them to change their strategy in some way. And then the third purpose of sanctions is to signal. And this is, I argue, this is the least appreciated aspect of sanctions, because most people, when they, even scholars, when they talk about, well, sanctions, it's just really a symbolic gesture. I think it was Margaret Doxey in her famous work in the 70s, looking back at Rhodesia, sanctions on Rhodesia, said these are just gesture sanctions. They're not, but what are gestures actually? When I think about this, sanctions, all UN sanctions are based on a whole series of preambulatory paragraphs that are about international norms. So sanctions, all sanctions that we look at are sending signals, normative signals about activity, either condemning an activity or articulating a hierarchy among norms. So that this is a relatively underappreciated aspect of sanctions, because they all send these normative signals. They're not always so clear because of the process by which they're developed, but they are sending normative signals. And they're attempting to stigmatize targets in certain ways. Now, sometimes people are proud to be on the list. That's one version of it, close supporters and allies of a government. But other times there is a certain stigmatization. When, for example, the head of state of Sudan has to check with people who've invited him to their country to see if they're signatories of the ICC and whether they're going to turn him over to the ICC. Thus far, that hasn't happened, and he's been to several ICC signatory countries. That's a different matter. But nonetheless, he's stigmatized in certain environments. He has to check before he travels. And this is at one level, an example of the stigmatization. So I think this is a relatively under-researched aspect, because sanctions are more than just words and critical diplomatic condemnations of behavior. They're costly signals, because they're imposing costs on the target, and they're voluntarily imposing costs on the sender. Because when sanctions are applied, it means that if they're implemented, if they're enforced, businesses that used to benefit from the trade are now being cut off. The best example of this, it's not a UN example, but would be the example of the European Union sanctions on Russia. Those are very costly for Europe, particularly for Germany, for the Baltic republics, for countries closely integrated with the former Soviet Union, and Russia subsequently. It's more than just words, because it's saying we're willing to pay these costs ourselves because we feel so strongly about the principle of the territorial integrity of states and the unacceptability of forcible acquisition and annexation of other people's territory. So these are multiple purposes. And when we talk about the effectiveness of sanctions, I should have mentioned this earlier, we look at the effectiveness in each of these purposes. Are they effective in coercing a change? Are they effective in constraining an actor? Are they effective in sending a clear signal that stigmatizes the target? But as I said, most of the debate focuses just on the first one. Everyone wants to talk about, well, and that's usually why people say sanctions don't work, do they? Well, they don't work because they don't coerce a change in behavior, but they may actually constrain or signal. I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, some of our general findings, we have lots of them. There's a book, it's ongoing research, and it's an ongoing investigation, and this is the problem. I can't seem to escape sanctions now. Normally, I move on after a decade or so of working, like you mentioned, we work on sovereignty and private authority. This has been 2 decades now. I can't seem to escape sanctions, but it's a fascinating subject. I'll say more about that later. But first of all, very interesting. We didn't find a single episode. Remember all those line segments I had up on those previous colorful charts? We don't find a single episode in which a single type of sanction was imposed and effective on its own. So if you just impose an arms embargo, don't expect it's going to be successful, even in sending an effective signal. Effectiveness is associated with 3 or more different types of targeted measures being applied at the same time. And the standard 3 are arms embargo, asset freeze, travel ban. So those tend to be, and basically it's category 2. Notice if we add them up, it leads to basically category 2 level sanctions. UN sanctions are also never used alone. This is another very important point because, as I said, what the standard trope is sanctions don't work, do they? Why are they always being applied? Well, it's interesting. We don't say diplomacy doesn't work or war doesn't work. Well, maybe we should say war doesn't work because we have some pretty good examples of interventions that are pretty dreadful in terms of their outcomes. But the fact is that sanctions are never applied in isolation. In fact, 97% of the cases involve some kinds of negotiations underway at the same time. So what we should be doing increasingly is looking at how sanctions interact with the use of other policy instruments, other policy tools. They should be understood in terms of their relationship and the interactive effects they have with other instruments, things like threats of force, use of force, peacekeeping operations, referrals to legal tribunals, either regional or legal tribunals at the regional level or at the global level, like the ICC. So we should be looking at them in their larger context, not in isolation. So it doesn't make sense to say one particular instrument works or doesn't work. We need to see how it interacts with others. In fact, back to that slide, that's the subject of a project that's not on maybe it's not on the webpage yet, but I have a new project with UN University and with Swiss Peace when we're actually looking now at detailed case studies of the relationship between sanctions and mediation. I'll show on the slide why in a moment. Because effective coercion, we find, is associated with mediation or shifts in negotiating strategies. In fact, to some extent, if we say we want to look in detail at the case of Iran and its agreement and the signing of the JCPO, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it involved both a promise of subsequent lifting or relaxation of sanctions combined with a negotiated settlement. These talks, the E3+3 or P5+1, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. If you're in Europe, you should call it the E3+3. This is actually a good example of the association of sanctions and not the application of sanctions, but the promise of lifting them and how that can be effective in mediation. So we started this new project. We have 6 teams many of them are themselves people who were involved in mediation efforts. We have several SRSGs, former special representatives of the Secretary General working with us. Again, policy practitioners in from the start. We're doing this with the Mediation Support Unit and the Sanctions Unit in the Secretariat. And we just finished our last launch of the teams looking in detail at when sanctions complement mediation efforts and when sanctions complicate, because it's not a simple yes or no. It turns out it's very complex there. It's very contingent. And we'll know more in a year. So we'll have our first results by November of next year. Effective constraint, we find, is generally associated with use of force. And again, that makes sense because if you're constraining a military actor's ability to gain access to resources, to buy arms, to continue the conflict, and you're also enhancing the military activities, that's more likely to lead to successful constraint. Effective signaling is interestingly associated with very public legal referrals when someone is referred to the criminal court or a regional body like the ICTY, the ICTR, the Special Court in Sierra Leone, and so on. And also very large, symbolic gestures and diplomatic statements. So there's just a table that shows. Now these are, it looks impressive, it looks like numbers, it looks scientific. The number in our sample is very small. I wouldn't even call these correlated, they're associations, but they're interesting associations and worthy of study, and that's why we've launched this new project with, again, support from the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland. UN sanctions are never applied in isolation either. Not only are there other policy instruments, but there are other sanctions regimes at play. I could give you the Iran story, but if I only told you the UN part of the Iran story, you'd have only a part of the picture. Because there were US unilateral sanctions against Iran dating back to the revolution in 1979. There were significant increases in the application of European Union sanctions against Iran, starting gradually in 2010, but really escalating in 2012. So we have to look at how the UN sanctions are embedded in other sanctions regimes. But interestingly, one of my students did a very interesting process tracing thesis, master's thesis, in which he found that the UN sanctions are oftentimes vital for the justification of EU measures. So the EU refers back to the UN when it, in fact, applies its own measures. But a couple of points about the relationship between UN sanctions and regional sanctions. 62% of the UN sanctions involve other regional organizations applying sanctions at the same time. And the interesting point is, more often than not, the UN follows regional actors. So the UN is not the first actor to apply sanctions. I can give you 3 empirical examples. The OAS applied sanctions against Haiti before the UN did. The Arab League applied sanctions against Libya in 2011 before the UN did, even though the UN reacted in 11 days, the fastest we have on record in terms of noticing a problem and applying sanctions. Many of the African conflict cases, DRC, it took the UN 43 months after it noticed there was a big problem in the Democratic Republic of the Congo before it actually applied sanctions. And it was only after repeated efforts coming from the regional organization, from the African Union, saying we need UN sanctions to back up our regional efforts. So the UN is oftentimes, and again, it makes sense, read the charter of the UN, and it talks about resolving the conflict at the regional level before taking it to the UN level. So it looks to the regional organizations first. And that means that you've got a complex mix of different sanctions, sometimes with different purposes, complicating things. European Union sanctions are present in nearly 70% of our episodes. But the EU focuses, it tends to be on promoting human rights, rule of law, and democracy support. And so the EU sanctions tend to be applied not on EU members, but on Belarus, Moldova, Tunisia, Egypt, Burma, Zimbabwe. These are EU measures and notice several of these cases are not on the UN list. That's another story. But, African Union. Now the other point is the AU applies sanctions all the time. People usually see the map and many African countries are being targeted for sanctions. Well, that's because the AU has already targeted them. If you have a non-constitutional change of government in Africa, you're immediately suspended from the AU. You're not allowed even to come to the meetings discussing your case. And oftentimes the AU at least talks a rather tough talk about applying broad sectoral measures against countries as well. So they tend to focus on non-constitutional changes of government, and literally the first thing they do is suspend membership. So different regional organizations operate in different ways, but all of these sanctions interact, and oftentimes, there are no ASEAN one. That's another interesting example. I gave a version of this talk in National University of Singapore not too long ago. But there aren't any ASEAN. It's interesting, when we first set up our database, we put a category for every major regional organization, and we found that we never had anything to check yes when we got to ASEAN because they're more interested in economic than these types of interventions. Unintended consequences. Yes, of course, all policy measures have unintended consequences, but there are quite a few when it comes to the application of sanctions. 94% of our cases have some kind of unintended measure. That is something that wasn't anticipated or intended when the sanctions were first designed. Among the most common, corruption or criminality. Not surprising, because economic sanctions are a suspension of activity, and if you find a way around those sanctions, you're going to make a lot of money in a very short period of time. The best evidence of this comes from my former colleague at Brown, Peter Andreas's work on the former Yugoslavia, and the ways in which the networks that were established to get around the EU and UN sanctions created a legacy of criminality that still exists, because the networks created to evade, they still function even after the sanctions have been lifted. They just switch into other areas of delivering prescribed goods. So criminality, corruption, and humanitarian effects. Of course, the broader the sanctions, the more people, innocent people, are going to be caught up in them. And that's one reason why we made some policy recommendations I'll show in a moment. However, unintended consequences are both positive and negative. We have a positive unintended consequence. I think I can make this case. The entire regime that has developed around counter-terrorist financing has improved state capacity to monitor corruption, to monitor illicit flows, transnational criminal organizations, tax evasion. And it's an issue of interest in Switzerland, but I won't, this is not a Swiss audience, so I won't go on that one at this point. But in fact, the capacity of states to monitor, to regulate, has gone up substantially because of the amount invested to counter the financing of terrorism. So there's an unintended consequence that one could say as positive, not negative externalities. Um, because of the humanitarian effects, though, I've recently, in a session with the Secretariat staff, said that if you get to a category 3 or higher, when you have a panel of experts monitoring the implementation, we have an expert here on the panels of experts. He's just finished his thesis with us and is now joined as a postdoc here at the Institute. When you have category 3 or higher sanctions, put a member of the panel who looks for the humanitarian impacts, because you're likely to have unintended humanitarian impacts. And it's a way of actually improving the quality of reporting. And then a point from another PhD, but not, I guess I was the external. This is from the University of Hamburg, recent PhD, where very interesting. The UN and the European Union is the same. They pass a resolution, they apply sanctions, they lift something, they add new people, and they think, well, that's it. They put out a press release. Sanctions have been applied. End of story. Well, if you do that and don't combine it with a political strategy, you're basically turning the political spin over to the authoritarian leaders you're trying to control, in a sense. So what you're doing is you're allowing the Robert Mugabes of the world to define, this is an attack on Zimbabwe. This is neo-colonialism again. And in fact, without a communication strategy, what you're doing is you're applying measures without an effective engagement with the domestic populations, because ultimately these become politicized. And one of the other unintended consequences is increases in authoritarian rule and decreases in the quality of human rights. So these are things that need to be taken into consideration. Now, the big question, effectiveness. I won't, if you want, I've got slides on how we do it. Just for now, trust me, I'll describe the method if you want. Depending on, this seems to be a more, I don't know if it's more scholarly or less, more general audience. So let me say, in general terms, we find across all of these cases of UN targeted sanctions, that sanctions are effective about 20% of the time. Now, my friends in the Secretariat, when we first came out with this, were just, oh, that's terrible. And can't we do better than this? And I said, well, look, this is our assessment. This is what we see. But I said, don't be so disheartened, because look at that list of countries. Think of the conflict in Yemen, in Libya, North Korea. These are DRC. These are some of the most complex, difficult, protracted problems in the world. So we're selecting from the most difficult cases. So the fact that we have as much as 20%, I think, is actually pretty good. Now, it's interesting when we break this down, because they're nearly 3 times more effective in constraining and signaling than they are in coercing a change in behavior. And again, this probably shouldn't surprise us so much, because obviously it's very difficult to get public officials to change behavior that's been proscribed by the international community through UN Security Council sanctions regime. They're not. There are some cases where they do change their behavior, but they're very few and far between. So it's easier to constrain. It's easier to send a signal. But the interesting point is here are the numbers that we have on this. When it comes down to coercing a change in behavior, we say basically you have a 1 in 10 chance of coercing a change in behavior. But sometimes it happens, and sometimes it happens with great significance. And I would argue that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran is a good example of that, where the UN sanctions were necessary, not sufficient, combined with many other things and with other sanctions, nonetheless, did result in a change in behavior. Constraining and signaling, the surprise to me is, why is signaling not any higher? But that has a lot to do with the politics of the Security Council, which I can field in Q&A when we get to it. Types of sanctions. Arms embargoes, the UN loves to apply arms embargoes. There's a conflict, cut off the arms. It's a logical, the flow of arms, the supply of arms to adversaries or combatants. But if you're just imposing an arms embargo without anything else, it's never effective. So it's a feel-good measure. It sounds like the obvious thing to do, but in fact, sometimes it can be disastrous. In fact, the first episode I mentioned, the case in Yugoslavia, the UN was fair and balanced, applied the measures to all parties to the conflict, and just without looking in detail to notice that all the arms production facilities happened to be in Serbia and Montenegro. So what they did was they shifted the entire balance of power in the conflict, because they were being fair, to benefit the Serbian side. That wasn't quite the intention, but that's an example of just applying an arms embargo. And they did the same thing in Rwanda. The genocide was nearly completed by the time they applied an arms embargo and nothing else. In fact, I think it was in the last 3 weeks. And of course, most of the killings in Rwanda were not with imported arms in any event. It was locally obtained machetes. So it sounds like it's a popular measure, but in fact, on its own does nothing. Commodity sanctions, when they are appropriate, they're not always appropriate for all conflicts, but they are quite effective. In nearly 40% of the episodes, they appear to be quite highly effective. So diamond, timber, charcoal did seem to shift the balance of power. And this is one of our hypotheses in our research now in the relationship between sanctions and mediation efforts. But effective sanctions are associated with multiple types, at least 3, and actually closer to 4 different measures being applied at the same time. Another very interesting, the UN doesn't like to apply secondary sanctions on other countries, but every once in a while it does. And the 2 times it's done this, they've been effective. The first was applying secondary sanctions on Liberia over its support for the Sierra Leone government. The second was against Eritrea over its support of al-Shabaab in Somalia. And both times we can see tangible effects of change in behavior or constraining of the actors as a result. Institutional learning. I mentioned there is some learning by mentioning that slide before, how the UN is becoming more targeted over time. But we've seen a slight increase. The UN's, but on average, it's not statistically significant. The samples are small. There's some increase in effectiveness over time in coercing and signaling. More interestingly, we find that the longer sanctions are in place, in particular conflict zones, the increase in effectiveness over time, so that they're not terribly effective in getting a ceasefire or a negotiated settlement, but they are effective in peace maintenance and peace building. So in the later stages of conflicts, and if we went back to that slide in the beginning, you would see these long episodes that go on for long periods of time at the end. Those are usually peace building, the Liberian sanctions that went on for almost an additional decade. Ironically, not because the UN Security Council wanted to continue them, because the Liberian government wanted them continued. Ellen Sirleaf Johnson basically said, I need this external pressure to win internal battles within the government, within skepticism in the Liberian parliament over the timber certification scheme. So she used the external basis to strengthen her hand domestically against her opponents. Institutional learning within the UN. Some people say, well, institutions can't learn, only people can learn. There's a whole debate about this. But I would say the amount of information, I said any one of us can be targeted. It's harder to target randomly today. It never was random, literally, but it was close to it at some point. But the amount of information that you now have to have on what someone has done, where they live, what their bank accounts are, their passport numbers, date of birth, domicile, all these things that's increased substantially over time. The introduction of panels of experts. When the UN first started applying targeted sanctions and comprehensive sanctions, it didn't have expert panels. Today, the norm is to establish a panel of experts, independent experts, who monitor compliance with the measures and report on a routine basis to the UN Security Council on their activities. So that's another major institutional innovation. And I'll say something more about this. The due process procedures for individuals who have been targeted. I said in a bit of a quip earlier that if you're on the list, let me know. I can tell you what at least the procedures are. I can't get you off. Ironically, if you're on the counterterrorism list, you have more due process protection than if you're a friend of Laurent Gbagbo in the Côte d'Ivoire. Interestingly, the ombudsperson office that has been established, and again, I can elaborate on that because I'm quite involved in the process, in fact, only applies to counterterrorism individuals, not to the people on the list from Sudan, DRC, Mali, and others. Now, I've gone a bit long. I think I started a few minutes late, but I was supposed to stop at 7. A few more, let me wrap up. I can go on for hours about sanctions. I actually teach a course, and I'm in the process of developing a course for the UN, for the panels of experts and for elected members of the council on sanctions and situating them. So that's my teaching assignment this year, is a new course I'm developing. Well, the general challenges are you probably tell from what I was, the sort of normative tone of what I was saying earlier, it's hard to keep targeted sanctions targeted. They were introduced initially, at least the arguments in the early 90s, late 90s, excuse me, was the humanitarian effects of the comprehensive sanctions against the population in Iraq were so extreme that the ends did not justify the means. They were actually having all sorts of negative consequences. And that was really what led to this whole movement to develop the instrument of targeted sanctions. In theory, targeted sanctions shouldn't be as non-discriminating as comprehensive measures. And the other point is a normative point. Why should a population in an authoritarian country be held accountable for the actions of a small elite that they probably had no power, influence, or control over in the first place? So that's just the other point about, is it normatively correct to apply these measures? So it's great. Targeted sanctions normatively should be preferable to comprehensive measures. That's an easy argument to make at the outset. The problem is they're targeted in design, but they're broadened in implementation. And we have what we call a two-translation problem, because a UN Security Council resolution passed under Chapter 7 is legally binding on all member states. But member states have to translate that into domestic law. Now, Austria doesn't have this problem because it's a member of the European Union, so Brussels does it for you, sort of. They come up, but then whatever happens in Brussels still then has to be interpreted into the communications that come from Austrian ministries to Austrian private sector firms. So first there's the translation, how states translate these measures. But then there's a second translation, the financial sanctions, for example. It's dependent on banks to decide whether or not they should block this transfer or close this account. And so the private sector implementation, in fact, the regime depends very heavily on the private sector. And banks have their own concerns. So they have their risk portfolios. They're managing risk all the time. They're making calculations about how much should we go along with? Yes, we see this name on the list, but maybe we should, anyone with a similar name, just in case. Or maybe we should just put the whole country on, and that's actually de-risking, and that's what's happening today in Syria. So that's the first problem. Another problem is the coexistence of multiple sanctions regimes. I alluded to this before. The fact is you have in place simultaneously multiple sanctions regimes. You have UN, EU, US unilateral, and sometimes African regional measures. If you're a target, you're not differentiating. You're just being sanctioned. And so you'll have a situation where the targets actually don't make the distinction that, well, the UN sanctions are more targeted than the EU sanctions, because they're just the international sanctions as a whole. It's very hard to get this level of sophistication, even amongst academics or policymakers. So targets don't differentiate. And the language of resolutions oftentimes contains a phrase calling upon member states to exercise vigilance with regard to ABC. What that means is the EU says, well, that means we should add additional measures. And the US and the EU will justify additional measures because we've been called upon to exercise vigilance, and that's how we're exercising vigilance, by raising the number of sanctions. Well, the Russians and Chinese say, wait a minute, no, the UN sanctions are what are legal. Anything you do above that is illegal. So that's what we call the floor-ceiling debate. The permanent five members are divided. The E3, the P3, US, France, and UK say, this is the floor upon which we build other measures. China and Russia say, no, that's the ceiling of what's accepted. So this is stymied. We haven't had a new sanctions regime for 3 years, but that has something to do with Russia being targeted and feeling a little bit affected by sanctions itself. Technical challenges. Engaging the private sector is essential because you're calling upon the private sector to implement these measures. The banks, insurance companies, shipping companies. That's necessary. If you want to design measures that are effective and are going to have fewer unintended consequences, you need to bring the private sector in. But there's also a danger of bureaucratic capture because they're sitting around the table planning the regulations that are going to affect them. So there is this sort of constant negotiation between public and private on these measures. The automatic extensions of regimes now that come to an end after 18 months. Well, the standard operating procedure in the UN in New York is just, well, we'll extend them for another 18 months. This means there's not a review. Do we still need these measures? How effective are they? So oftentimes it's just easier to keep the train moving than, in fact, to reinvestigate the measure. This weakens and diffuses signals, and it makes it hard to end. Implementation challenges. These are many. Growing complexity of the Security Council resolutions. My team, when we update the app, which we do on an annual basis, and our users actually, it's a nice compliment. They say you need to do it more often because you only do it once a year. But I can tell you, it takes us weeks and weeks of detailed work to go through what's happened in the last year in all these cases. They're getting so complex that we spent 3 days on the last North Korea resolution. It was that complex. They have prohibitions. You can't import this. They have conditional measures, which are if you have reason to suspect that that ship carrying this cargo might contain prohibited goods, you are obligated to board and inspect. So how do you implement that? These are conditional measures. If you have, and so the U.S. says yes, we'll board, and the Chinese say no, we never have that kind of information. You have additional measures. These are suggestions of what else. These are the exercise vigilance. So now the resolutions are broken into these 3 different component parts. So it's much. In the old days, we just had prohibitions. Now it's getting more and more complicated. Monitoring and enforcement are constant issues. Some of the UN monitoring teams, panels of experts, are being politicized. The proliferation ones are very high salience to the permanent members. And so when I met with the Iran panel, they introduced themselves not as the financing expert or the shipping expert or the proliferation goods expert, but they introduced themselves as, well, I'm the US expert, I'm the Chinese expert, I'm the Russian expert. So they're even self-identifying the ways in which it's becoming that politicized. There's variation in the quality of the different teams, turnover of personnel, and mandatory turnover of personnel. You can't continue in the same position. I don't know what the number, Orel can tell us, but the number of terms panel members have. And then, of course, there's the constant problem of UN coordination, but I won't get into that, except to say that everyone says we need more coordination, and nobody wants to be coordinated. Legal challenges. Now, this is the targeting of individuals. When this was first introduced, it was considered a really creative innovation that we're going to go after the individuals responsible for the policies, not penalize the whole country. But that's okay if you're going after public, politically exposed persons. But what happens when you're going after 500 people who are in some ways associated with the bank that once made a loan to someone named Mr. Bin Laden? That actually led to serious questions about what happens if you change your behavior and you can't get off. How do you get off the list? What are the due process? How are you notified? Do you have access? Is there a hearing? Can you get effective remedy? None of these things were provided in the regime. It's been a big struggle. Some of you may have heard of the Cadi case. Mr. Cadi, it's Cadi 2 now, series of court cases in the European courts system. We now have Cadi 2 and its implications. He was delisted before he won the case, but he did win the case in the end. What this means is that the European Union, lawyers in the EU are saying, not just lawyers, individuals targeted are appealing and taking cases first against national governments and then to European courts saying the process by which I was listed does not meet EU human rights standards. And so this raises a whole series of legal issues, and it basically potentially delegitimates the instrument because the initial reaction, in fact, the European Court of Justice ordered the European Union to take Mr. Cadi off the list, which meant what the EU was saying, but what the UN Charter says, it has primacy in international law. We're just following, and no, the court said, but European human rights are fundamental as well, and at the same time. So basically they said, you must take him off. There was a compromise. He was taken off for 3 months, but he was immediately relisted. It's another story. But it potentially delegitimizes the whole instrument if you don't deal with the due process issues. And in fact, the other thing that's happening now I'm getting into EU sanctions, which I shouldn't, but EU sanctions are actually becoming broader for a reason, and that's because, I'll mention that later. The European Union is losing about 2/3 of the legal cases taken against the European Union and now for its own sanctions. So the EU how do they solve that? Well, we don't have enough public information that we can release about this individual's activities, but we do know that he's in a category which makes a certain amount, or he's working in a bank that makes a certain amount of money. So we're just going to say the new criteria for listing are all banks above a certain threshold, which we can prove, and then we can't be accused of violating the rights of that institution. So what's happening is the EU is now systematically broadening. So again, we're back to the challenge of keeping targeted sanctions targeted. Then there's the realm of the permanent exception. This is counterterrorism. We have we have a so-called war against a tactic, and a metaphorical war against a tactic doesn't end. We have a permanent counterterrorism machinery. It's morphed from Taliban, Al-Qaeda Taliban, Al-Qaeda and associates, Al-Qaeda associates, ISAC, now ISIL, which has now been named ISAC, ISIL Al-Qaeda. And what they're doing is they're creating a comprehensive Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, all these different groups are being put under the same committee, in effect. So it's becoming a permanent institution. It's a bit like the IAEA. This is our question about, is it time to rethink the whole regime itself? But that's another argument in the concluding chapter of the book. And then in Geneva, we faced the whole question about, are unilateral measures by the EU and US legal? Because only UN, by the very narrow reading, only UN sanctions are legal under international law. All others are unilateral coercive measures, and so now the High Commissioner of Human Rights has a special rapporteur for the human rights implications or violations of human rights as a result of unilateral coercive measures, and the Human Rights Council passed a resolution in 2014. These are the political challenges. The targets are weakening, the challenging implementation, the 1267 I mentioned more recently, 44% of the cases coming from Iran. Pending in other regimes, the EU lost 2/3 of the cases in 2015, improved a little bit in 2016. I mentioned the Human Rights Council resolution. This is the sort of political mobilization against the instruments. So there are lots of challenges. And then the contemporary policy, and I'll close with this. Big question on this is why I can't escape sanctions. It's a weekly thing. So Mr. Trump decides he's going to decertify. Maintaining the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran is we already pointed out a year ago, this is a big challenge. Iran has complied to date with the IAEA has been quite consistent. But of course, they haven't gotten full sanctions relief. If you look into the details, and only those of us who really get into the weeds do this, it turns out there are still some UN sanctions on Iran. If you go to the UN webpage, there's a box saying sanctions lifted on Iran. But if you read the JCPOA, there's an annex, and there's a little on the first page. It refers to the annex. The annex doesn't apply sanctions; it applies restrictive measures. Well, if there are any international lawyers here, you know that restrictive measures are sanctions. So all we've done is renamed it. They got rid of the committee. But now there's still a non-permanent member who's responsible for the Iran case. And the panel of experts was disbanded, but the Secretariat hired additional people to monitor Iran. So the sanctions regime by any other name, anyway, would smell as sweet. But that's now the Trump decertification. It's like much of Donald Trump. I don't like to talk about this. You can tell from my accent and one of my nationalities is U.S. It is painful. The decertification is typical Trump symbolic politics to the base. In the end, it might not mean anything. And if you read, and very few people have done this, I can say I've done it. I've read the whole JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The unilateral actions by the U.S. cannot, in and of themselves, automatically trigger a resumption of the sanctions. So the so-called snapback only happens after a very complex governance procedure, which requires a form of mandatory arbitration between, would be in this case, between the US and Iran with other signatories of the JCPOA on the arbitration panel. So this is just a symbolic move. It could go very badly. I'm not saying this is good. I'm just saying, yes, it's typical Trump. It's a symbolic action to his base. Whether Congress acts on it or how Congress acts on it, and whether or not snapback happens is quite far down the road. And European diplomats are doing everything they can to block this. I mentioned a moment ago about the problem of Banks translation. What's happened today is that we have, even though there are no UN sanctions on Syria, most financial institutions, major financial institutions, they've engaged in what's called de-risking. They simply say, it's too risky for us to finance anything going to Syria. We just don't have enough due diligence. We don't have enough information inside the bank. We can't actually do this. So therefore, if it's Syria bound, just block it. We're not going to do it. And I learned about this from another initiative with the Swiss government, where we brought together humanitarian actors operating in Syria today. And these are like Médecins Sans Frontières and ICRC, UN actors, NORAID, a whole series of different international actors trying to get relief into Syria in areas outside the conflict zone. And what they're finding is there's no formal sector banking channels open. There are none available. They can't get access to resources. People won't ship to them. Banks, insurance companies won't insure the goods. And so what's happening is we have a fundamental de-risking. We have a humanitarian crisis, even in areas far removed from the conflict, just because the name Syria is on. So there's a much, much bigger problem here. And then there's DPRK. This is the least likely case. After all, the whole history of this country is juche. It's keeping itself independent from external influences. So this is the country where sanctions should never work, just to begin with. China is key. Everyone says that. Now Russia is becoming key as well because they're the two principal sources of evasion. My solution for DPRK is simple. Don't widen the measures, deepen the measures. Go after the evaders. That's easier said than done because where are the most of the evaders? China and Russia. But they also need to be linked to resume negotiations and some efforts to do that. And of course, the new South Korean government is trying to do that, but North Korea is not too receptive. I can go on and on and on, but I did actually go to the very end. This is for more information if you want, and I'll take any questions you have and stay as long as you wish. But thanks very much for your attention, and we have a field question.
Thanks a lot, Tom, for this really comprehensive and insightful presentation into a topic about which one actually has lots of ideas without really having the facts. So I think this is very, very helpful to clear the picture in many ways. It is a complicated picture, but I think you've given us a lot of pointers to what works, what doesn't work, what works under certain conditions, etc. Let me open the floor with that for questions, because we have some people here in the room, I think, who have also experienced some of these sanctions regimes and may have a very different vantage point from which to engage with the topic. So the floor is open.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I'd like to ask a question, and you mentioned, I think, this briefly, like Russia and the annexation of Crimea. Was the only reason that no sanctions have been introduced because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, or are there any other reasons for that? And how the UN actually should work with the permanent members of the Council when probably the UN should have introduced sanctions on them? And I mean, how do you deal with this situation?
Okay. I'm sorry, the second one was about Iran? No, Russia. Okay, sorry. I thought I misheard. We've done a study actually that was commissioned by the Rasmussen Group. The former NATO Secretary General has a consulting firm, the former Danish Prime Minister, which is available if you're interested, on where we've actually taken the same method we use to evaluate UN sanctions and tried to apply it to the EU and US sanctions on Russia. And again, as usual, it's complicated. There are actually three different sanctions regimes, three different targets of sanctions. First of all, there are remnants of the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych who were targeted independently around the time that he fled the country. There is a complete comprehensive sanction on Crimea. So we actually have EU I said, actually, I think I misspoke then. I said there are all EU sanctions are targeted, but technically speaking, the EU sanctions on Crimea are in fact comprehensive, block of all trade, all financial measures. And then of course there are the measures on Russia. And the background, of course, goes to the real trigger at the outset. I mean, it was already the interference and intervention in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, the so-called Green Man, and all of those stories about the summer of two. But in fact, I think the territorial annexation of Crimea was the big issue, at least in terms of the original motivation. Now, the situation, what we've done is we've applied our method of looking at to what extent has Russia been coerced into changing its behavior? Zero, of course. Has it been constrained? Arguably, but not very much. Has an effective signal been sent? Well, there I think we're on stronger ground. There may be some evidence that the sanctions have been important for sending a strong signal, much more than if there had been no response. Now, as part of this study, we also looked at who bears the costs of the sanctions, because if you look at the 28 members, some of the members that are screaming the loudest about how much they're hurting because of the sanctions are actually not affected at all. And some of the strongest advocates for sanctions are the ones who are bearing the costs. So the Baltic republics, Germany in particular, Poland. Not only the cost of the EU measures, but then the Russian countermeasures. But it's a very interesting case for all sorts of reasons, and it's linked to negotiations now, which I think is positive. So in theory, the way out with the Russian sanctions regime is through the Minsk process. The problem is Minsk isn't going anywhere at the moment. So that was, I mean, at least it started Minsk 1, now Minsk 2. So there is at least a negotiation framework. I think there are some ways out. I think it's a fascinating case for joint European and Russian studies, quite frankly. So I lectured on this in St. Petersburg and Moscow last year. Actually, the way I pitched it, my host said, just be careful because they thought there might be some disruption and this is a very, very controversial subject. And I said, okay, well, let me just preface the talk by saying, I'm going to talk about the sanctions that Russia supports. And the audience was a little bit like, what sanctions do we support? Well, of course, the UN, because all UN sanctions, to be UN sanctions, Russia has to support them in some way, at least not veto the measure. So it was a way of starting the discourse, but it's very politicized within Russia. I tried in Ngimo, where I have another joint project, to talk to people working on the issue and found that very few people are actually working on the issue. It's very difficult politically to do research on this, but I think ideally it would be a wonderful subject for a joint European and Russian team to look at, because most of the sanctions regimes I've been talking about are very asymmetrical. I mean, there may be one or two sanction specialists in Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia, but not likely. And the capacity of targeted countries to retaliate is very limited. So the Russia case becomes fascinating because Russia can retaliate and could have retaliated in a much more forceful way. So now the question is, did the sanctions, the relatively moderate, they were relatively proportional, did that prevent a stronger reaction? After all, Russia could have really interfered with oil and gas in a very significant way for Europe, which would have been much, much more costly. So it's an interesting domain to explore in terms of. But we have two reports, one on EU sanctions, one on the impact of sanctions on the U.S., which are relatively minor, but those are available if you're interested. I don't know if I addressed the question fully, but there's a lot on it. Sorry. Yep. Yep.
Just briefly, so I come from my recent history actually puts me along the practitioner side.
Okay.
I've been for quite a long time into public office, and back in 2005, I was representing my country, Romania, as a non-permanent member in the Security Council. And I come back to your words. You are absolutely aware that describing the sanction regime is actually alluding to a presumptive reform of the Security Council.
Sure.
How would you go? Can you go deeper into this?
Sure. Be happy
Thank
to.
You.
Well, what is that, and where and what are reforms of the Security Council? There is a fundamental, obviously. I mean, we know the history. It's a Faustian bargain, giving the veto, granting the veto to these 5 members that happen to be the victorious side. And we all know that the legitimacy of the council is at question in terms of why these 5, why only these 5, who's not represented, are there ways of reforming? There were quite a few creative ideas about Security Council membership reform that were floated at the time of the 2005 summit. So precisely when you were there, all of these ideas about expanding the council to 20 or 22. Exactly. So to try to expand the members, add potentially new permanent members, but not necessarily with the veto, most likely without the veto. And the usual suspects, I mean, India, Brazil, Germany and Japan because of the size of the economies and their contributions to the UN system. These were the top four. But then the politics of the change, should France or the UK, well, certainly not the UK now, give up its veto or its permanent seat to the EU. I don't see that happening from the UK at the moment. Certainly not from France either. And the opposition from Argentina to Brazil, from Pakistan to India, from Italy to Germany, quite frankly. I mean, so getting even these types of reforms proved very difficult, and the issue is simply not on the table at the moment. That being said, I don't give up on the idea of reform because there are other interesting ideas for reform that are currently underway. The Swiss government, for example, several years ago, tabled a resolution arguing that the veto could not be used or applied in situations of genocide or major violations of mass atrocity crimes international crimes being committed. And the Swiss had a majority in the General Assembly to support this, and it was only the P5 who came in at the last minute, put pressure on the office, basically on the SG, the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, to look into the Office of Legal Affairs, and they came up with a constitutional interpretation that would take 2/3, not 50%. So Switzerland pulled this off. Today, however, the French have a proposal for reform of the veto. And that's much more important when it's coming from a permanent member. And it is basically saying that the application of the veto in cases of genocide, in cases of crimes against humanity, would be raised to 2. Now, it doesn't sound like radical change, but the way reform works is not typically through a redesign, but in fact through incremental measures. A third way, and this is something that I think is I just attended a conference on, and you should have been there, on the role of elected members. And how elected members can shape how the UN functions and operates. When you're chairing a sanctions committee, I don't know which committees you chaired when Romania was in.
Well, it was first the Human Rights Council.
Okay.
And then the Security Council.
And the Security Council. Well, when I'm saying sanctions committees, as members, non-permanent members of the council are the ones who chair all the committees. Depending on the capacity and the interest of the non-permanent member, significant developments can take place, significant changes can take place. And in fact, just changing the operating procedures, the way in which how designations were made in the 1267 committee, the fact that placing of holds on discussion were given time limits. So the P5 couldn't just say, we're putting a hold on that, we're never going to discuss it again. That would expire after a certain point, and they'd have to be forced to use the veto if they really wanted to block something. So these are incremental changes. They're gradually opening up. There's a little bit more transparency. There's a group of countries, an informal intergovernmental organization called the ACT group, the Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency group. Switzerland, again, plays a very key role in. And they're working on trying to get more transparency, more openness, allow not only non-permanent members, but regular members to participate in some Security Council deliberations when they have a strong interest or strong responsibility. So there are lots of incremental things going along the way. And now since I'm in Vienna, I should make a reference to the important leadership of Austria in reforming due process. When Resolution 1822 was passed, Ambassador Meyer-Hartung was the Austrian ambassador at the UN at the time, and they basically went through the entire counterterrorism list, over 500 names, vetted each one to make sure there was quality information, current information, very systematically done. So they actually improved reforms and raised the level of the threshold for what it takes to get a name on the list today. So these are all, it sounds like incremental, it's not radical revolutionary, but I think actually these small moves oftentimes create the basis for much more important change. So that's my optimistic assessment of, and the potential power of the, and there's a whole debate, are they non-permanent members or are they the elected members? That's even a way of framing it. If they're the elected members, then they presumably have more power and authority in a democratic sense. So
I haven't read very much and benefit a lot from your presentation, but I have some observation. One observation is that what is the role of the governments which are made the decisions about sanctions in a very strong manner in the beginning. But later on, for personal interest of countries which has nothing to do with the principles for which they have made the decisions. They are compromising halfway for very narrow reasons and personal or country interest. I give you one example. Take Sudan government. When the sanctions were passed, one of it was terrorism, part of the major reasons for it, human rights, and so the Europeans were very much concerned with human rights, with democracy, with all this, which we appreciate very much. But as time passed, new development has taken place and has started to weaken the basis for the sanctions. For instance, for the last couple of years, when migrants were coming through Sudan, North Sudan, to Libya, to go to the Mediterranean, the European Union and some countries which were directly affected by that start compromising with Sudan government to ask them to stop this movement. And for doing that, they compromise basic principles of human rights for the country itself, not the immigrants also. And to contradiction of what had happened, those people who were used by Sudan government as militia to suppress the people of their own country in Darfur, where now are the ones who have been used by Sudan government to stand near Libya border to stop the other immigrants who are coming from other African countries. For me, this is shocking and contradicting the basic principle. The second example I will mention, I'm sorry for going there, United States of America. When they made sanctions against Sudan government, basically it was economical and so, they made one conception for the economical aspect, that is gum Arabic. Sudan was at that time exporting 80% of the world's gum Arabic, which entered into so many industries in America and in the developed countries. And without that, of course, the American interests would be affected, so they excluded the gum Arabic. And now, very recently, Trump has taken out, starting with the Sudan out of the list, and nobody understands what was the real reason for doing that, logically or convincing for anybody. Sorry, thank you very much. I need your comment.
Respond quickly about it's a good illustration of a point I may have rushed over in one of the slides of the automatic renewal of sanctions, which leads to the inability to articulate or re-articulate the original purposes. One of the arguments, this was a big argument back in the late 90s, mostly between France and the US, and that was whether or not there should be sunset clauses, that the sanctions would automatically come to an end at a certain point, or at least be subject to renewal. And what happened was the US in particular was, and the UK at the time, looking at the Iraq experience, were very concerned that if they allowed these to have an end date at the outset, it would provide an incentive for targets simply to wait until the end date, and then you'd have to reestablish the political will. But the point that you raise about the situations are changing dramatically on the ground. The original purposes may be very clear. The conflicts may have abated. There may be other issues. The advantage of targeted measures is that they can be adapted. They're not like comprehensive measures, which are an all or nothing measure. They can be adapted over time. They can be strengthened. They can be relaxed. They can be linked to negotiations. That's the beauty of targeted sanctions, in a way that they can be a more manipulable instrument in this way. The problem is they're not really used that way. Now, much of you could criticize my presentation, which is much of which is overly rationalistic and suggests that there's a logic and there's a design. There are these elements, but the Security Council is fundamentally a political body. So the design of these measures is less than optimal because of the political bargaining, the compromises. And I would say to your cases on Sudan in particular, the problem is that what should happen is not just a rollover of the resolution. Oh yes, we're still upset about Darfur. I think in the case of they just let the 90s one over the Mubarak assassination attempt in Addis. That one just ended without people paying much attention to the final resolution of it, since the Sudan said we never had the people anyway. But whatever. And in the case of Darfur, what should happen is there should be a serious review, not just a rollover or a continuation of the measures, but a review of, do we still need these measures? Do we still need them in place for these reasons? Do we have the right people targeted? Should we expand, contract to stay? I mean, the UN always said the resolutions always will remain seized of the matter, but in fact, they're not seized of the matter if it's not politically salient. So what happens is the longer these regimes remain in place, the less effective they are, and that undermines the credibility of the instrument as a whole. But what I think is lacking is a kind of periodic review that should say, what's the situation now? Do we need to keep these measures in place? If they need to be adapted, why, and be public about it. But that's actually not the way it operates for the most part, particularly in the case of many of the African conflict situations, which are just left to sort of wallow and not really be addressed. So this would call for a much more concerted effort to review why do we have them in place, how should we adjust them, and re-articulate the norm. If not simply say, all right, for these reasons we're going to compromise, because there are all sorts of, and the more you let them in place like this, the more you weaken the instrument in general, because you're right, there'll be defections from individual states. So.
Ivan Weber, the permanent fellow here at the IWM, to compliment you and congratulate you on this humongous effort, which I think will be valuable for everyone around. I'm one of the people that Shalini mentioned who has been under sanctions, being from Belgrade, Yugoslavia, now Belgrade, Serbia. Mm-hmm. And I remember how cavalier the government was. Oh, this will do nothing to us, don't worry, we'll survive. This is just a brief comment, Professor, to say that I'm glad that you mentioned the unintended consequences, because they have left, as you yourself mentioned, long-standing effects of criminalization of state and criminalization of society. And just to add to what I'm sure your colleague has written about, and that is also the spillover effect of criminalization to neighboring countries in such a small region, such as the former Yugoslavia and the Western Balkans, because other countries needed to be involved, or rather other criminal networks needed to be involved, so that energy, oil, etc. could be fueled into the country, or the cigarette smuggling that went out through Montenegro in particular. So Albania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, others were deeply involved. There were also strangely positive unintended consequences, for example, for Hungary and Budapest airport, because we all had to fly out of Budapest because, of course, air travel was banned. So we jokingly say that the ferry hedge, the other terminal, was built by people who were traveling through, and doubled the air travel. So just those few comments. But again, thank you very much.
Thanks also for those comments about the situation. I mean, it raises a more general point about the impacts or effects of sanctions on neighboring states. There is an article in the UN Charter, Article 50, that addresses the concerns of those, because disproportionately, I mean, if you think about who bears the cost, it's not just the target, but typically the immediate neighbors around the target state. And while this article has been in the Charter, it's been talked about, it's never been invoked, it's never been applied, and there are disproportionate effects on neighboring states. And in theory, it should lead to some kind of compensation or some type of additional training or some types of to address the issue. But in fact, it's a much broader challenge. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it's an important, again, unintended consequence. I should say one thing about the app. I don't have a computer console. I'm not going to give you it's free. You can download it and play with it as you wish. It has one feature when we talk about effectiveness of sanctions. Actually, I've written a paper recently about how we designed it. And we designed it in a way to remind people of the unintended consequences. So when you get to we have a checklist for practitioners, basically. This is, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought? But then we have, when we list our effectiveness, was it effective in coercing or constraining or signaling? Just below that, we say, what are the unintended consequences? So that if you're thinking about going back to a particular case, like the sanctions against Serbia and Montenegro in particular, you can see what were the legacies of the sanctions, just to remind practitioners, as you're developing these, think in advance, because of course that's unrealistic, because people making these, it's a crisis, they have to do something, they have to get something on paper by a certain date. On the other hand, at least if we can remind them that there are these other unintended, perhaps long-standing consequences of these measures, at least take them into consideration. Yes, please.
Hello, I have one small story and a question.
Good.
I also lived under sanctions, and I wrote about them for the Spanish newspaper El País. And let me just start with the story. Lowering this level of this fantastic presentation, I covered how it looks from Skopje in Macedonia. I was in a hotel, and on the third floor were the UN representatives. In the restaurants, people were wheeling and dealing how they were going to bust the sanctions. All the products in the hotel were from Serbia, so it was very difficult to really believe it. And continuation of the same trip, I was in my car on the Serbian-Macedonian border, and a young man, very decent looking, came up and said, would you drive me to Belgrade? I said, he looked okay. He said, don't be scared of me. I said, okay, I'll drive you to Belgrade. So we start talking. I said, what do you do? He said, I work for Marlboro. Do you smoke? Oh, no. I'm a violinist, but I had to work for some company. So why you don't have a car? I do. I left it at the border so we don't violate the sanctions. This is why I'm asking you for a ride. So this is how it functions on the ground. My question is...
So you've involved in evading sanctions now.
Yes, I was directly involved.
But I don't think you'll end up on the list for that. Okay.
And my question is, I'm really curious, when you target arms embargo one group in Syria, how do you monitor that? Thank you.
Good question, and a difficult one as well. Couple of points just on your stories. I know that they are. It's another aspect of, I guess, to put the positive spin on this, some degree of institutional learning. The example that you gave about all the goods being imported with all the UN personnel consuming the goods that must have come through in the same building, of course. It's at the level of coordination. Is there coordination or not? One of the biggest problems in the late 90s and early 2000s, if there were peacekeeping forces in the country, they actually they were not mandated to stop an arms import. All they could do is they could go to a customs agent. I talked to a Ghanaian peacekeeping officer, I think it was in Liberia, and he said, all we could do, I was head of the peacekeeping forces in this particular area of the country, and we had to go to the border and customs officials and say, that vehicle is carrying arms that's violation of the UN Security Council arms embargo. And the customs official would say, thank you very much for that information. And the truck would go through. So there was no mandate for the peacekeeping forces, even though these weapons might be used against those very same peacekeepers. That was the illogical nature of the situation. It's gotten a little bit better. Now, in fact, it's now become customary practice that when it comes to enforcing peacekeeping operations are given the mandate to enforce the UN sanctions. So we've made a little progress. So I don't want to say it works easily all the time. The Syria conflict it's dreadful. It's I hate to end on this note, but a very depressing, just a loss of lives, the continuation of the conflict, the inability of the UN to take action. Now, yes, the UN is taking action on ISIL and Al-Qaeda elements within the country. But how do you know where a particular, where this is going? And it's so easy to use so many different transfer points through different names, different incorporated companies, different. So it's virtually impossible. That's why when I mentioned the de-risking, that's why firms are basically just saying, if Syria is on the manifesto, just block the transfer altogether. But that creates a whole series of other problems now, and that's what we're seeing. And in fact, when I was first approached by the Swiss Development Corporation, I'm not doing research on this. I'm just moderating meetings with humanitarian actors and introducing them to regulators. And it's like they're on different planets. I mean, the regulators are saying, well, there are exemptions. Why don't you apply? And they're saying, but they don't even know there are exemptions, let alone their financial institutions don't know how to apply for these things. So it is very difficult. And in a conflict like Syria, where you have this constant fragmentation of groups morphing into one, merging, breaking apart again, even if they're on the approved list one day, they'll be on the list the other day. So it's almost an argument for, at least in Syria, I would think you would probably simply want to have a blanket arms embargo but again, why doesn't the UN have it? Because Russia has the veto, and China as well, quite frankly, has been using it with Russia. So all the efforts to try to impose sanctions on the Syrian conflict have been blocked. So that's why we only have the regional measures. But it's the challenge goes to Syria. Again, it's not one of our cases because it's not a UN case, but it's obviously a very important conflict. If you think about how arms inspectors work in other areas, the postdoctoral fellow at the end of your row just finished a PhD thesis at the Graduate Institute. He's here now at the Institute, Aurel Niederberger, and one of his papers in the thesis, very, very fascinating study of the whole evolution of how panels of experts identify the arms specialists and where they come from, how they think, how they operate. And if you read the panel of experts reports, sometimes they're really quite full of rich detail and information. In Aurel's thesis, he argues that in the beginning, the whole arms inspection was based on human rights, networks of human rights activists. And so it was linked to human rights issues. And then it became militarized or institutionalized through policing and militaries. And today it's forensic. And some of our colleagues in the Small Arms Survey are the ones who are going and looking at the ammunition, spent ammunition, saying where did this come from, and tracing retroactively where the arms are actually coming from. And they play a very powerful role in enforcement, because what they do, and they literally, if you read these reports, sometimes they're hundreds of pages long. They'll have photographs, they'll have piles of arms, they'll have stamps of the various the bullets being used to see where they were initially produced. And what it does is it's in the spirit of transparency. It puts the information out there. The council may not act on it, but it makes people more apprehensive about, well, if we linked these arms in Cote d'Ivoire, really originally came from Iran, and there was an embargo, an arms embargo. So once you start naming and shaming, and you start naming and shaming states, it at least makes them try to cover their tracks more. Whether or not it solves the problem, at least there is that sort of. So on a somewhat optimistic note, I'll conclude at least with a reference to how they operate. But you can talk to Aurel about that further. Anyway.
Yes, that's right. I forgot to say that we have a sanctions expert with us these days because he's one of our fellows from the CEFRI funded program, which funds your talk and funds the fellowships of our doctoral and postdoctoral students from Geneva to here. So this conversation can be continued at the lunch table on another occasions. Thank you very much for being with us. And this was probably the most comprehensive talk on targeted sanctions.
It wasn't comprehensive.
Not on comprehensive, but on the targeted sanctions. No, I think this was, I would really like to express my gratitude for the fact that you did go over time, because I think it really has made it a very, very comprehensive and insightful discussion of the EU's effectiveness and also the challenges in this whole area. And they're not going to go away. So this is a really, really relevant issue. And I hope we can have you back for more. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. And as I said, this conversation can be continued at the IWM further.
Excellent. Right, thank you. So, thank you.